Hey there, welcome back to another review, this time of X-Men, Days of Future Past. Now, this is a movie that I never really gave a chance until recently because the entire X-Men franchise had burned me. It had burned me so bad. I mean, you had X-Men The Last Stand, which was a disappointing misfire. You had X-Men Origins Wolverine, which was disappointing and a total piece of shit. You had The Wolverine, which was disappointing, boring, and lame, and ultimately, in my opinion, the most disappointing X-Men film to date. Then you had X-Men First Class, which had potential, but then it was wasted because it tried to tell too many stories at once and didn't do either of them justice, and it was pretty slow-paced and boring for the most part. And had too much talking and too much dialogue and not enough action. So, just like the Wolverine. So, this movie just didn't interest me. When it came out, I did not give a shit. I did not care because I was just burned by the X-Men franchise. I was burned so badly, you might as well have called me Cropsy. So it was just one of those things where, uh, it just didn't interest me. But in gearing up for Logan, I decided to give all the other X-Men films another watch, including The Last Stand and First Class and all of that, and also check out this movie, Days of Future Past. And it helps too, I got this for free because it was one of those buy three, get one free deals at buybacks, and this was the free one. And I checked it out a couple days ago, and it surprised me. It surprised the hell out of me. I actually liked the film. And I never thought I would be sitting here saying that. I mean, I'm having a hard time putting this into words, to be honest, because for the longest time, because I was so leery of certain things I'd heard about it, I was so leery of the resetting the timeline stuff. It just X-Men franchise for me personally was just a bunch of continuity errors and just fuck ups, and I was just you can't blame me for being leery. And but I checked it out and it surprised me. I enjoyed it. I thought it was a good movie. Now I wouldn't say I loved it. I did have some issues with it and it prevented me from loving the film, but overall I still did like the movie. And so yeah, I mean, like I said, it's just surprising. It's just surprising to me personally, because probably surprising for you guys too. Because if you follow my channel, you know I've actually said things about this movie, like, oh, resetting the timeline, it's lazy. Oh, that makes it so it's like there's nothing. The stuff that happened in the previous films never happened. I don't like that, and normally I don't like that. For example, in J.J. Abrams' Star Trek films, but here it's actually handled quite well, in my opinion, and because of the mistakes that were made previously with this franchise, with namely The Last Stand, there really wasn't any way to really do what this film wanted to do, other than to press the reset button. But anyway, X-Men Days of Future Past is a 2014 film. It was released on May 23rd of 2014. It had a $200 million budget, which is definitely on the screen, except for a few moments here and there, especially with the Sentinels. There's a scene where Magneto is using his powers to, I guess, put metal into the Sentinels so he can control them. There are certain up-close shots of the Sentinels and CGI that look really bad. I mean, I cannot believe that they looked at that and thought, yeah, that looks good. That doesn't look like shit. That doesn't look like PS1 era graphics or something, or Xbox era graphics, or a PlayStation 2 game. That looks fine for 2014. That up close to the Sentinel was just shit. That was really awful CGI. But for the most part, the budget is used quite well in the film. It was a big hit. It made $747.9 million. So it was definitely a success in the box office as well as critically, because a lot of critics enjoyed the film. Now, the director is Bryan Singer, who actually I had been hoping to return to the franchise. So it's crazy to me that I wasn't more interested in this film when it came out. And I think the large reason why is because the franchise had burned me so many times. I did not want to get burned again. And also, I wasn't interested in a sequel to First Class. But after watching First Class again and appreciating some more of the aspects of it, um, I was definitely more curious and more intrigued by this film. And it did pique my curiosity, and I saw it, and it actually, like I said, it was a good movie. But Bryan Singer comes back, and he manages to do what I honestly thought was the impossible, which was to bring this franchise back into the good graces, to end up, revitalizing the franchise and ending up giving it new life and making people respect it again. I felt First Class was an alright first step into that direction, but it had some other issues with it that really prevented it from being the film to me that really made the X-Men a franchise that was salvageable. Uh, that didn't really save the franchise. This movie, to me, it saved it. And that's what makes Apocalypse even more disappointing, is because it, and I'll talk about that later, but you could totally see what I mean. If you're a fan of this one, and then you see Apocalypse, and you're just like, what the fuck happened? Um, but anyway, this did save the franchise momentarily. And Bryan Singer was a big part of that. It was great to see him come back, and his direction in this is definitely a highlight of the film. It also features cinematography by Newton Thomas Siegel. It's edited by John Ottman. Features a score by John Ottman. It has a screenplay by Simon Kinberg, who just goes solo on this film. Uh, it also a screenplay. He writes the whole film. Simon Kinberg. Sorry, I see his name multiple times here, so it's kind of confusing my head here. Because he also helped with the story. So Simon Kinberg also helped with the story along with Jane Goldman and Matthew Vaughn. Um, the film stars Hugh Jackman, who returns as Wolverine. You have James McAvoy, who comes back as young Professor X. Uh, Michael Fassbender comes back as young Magneto. Eric Lensher. You have Jennifer Lawrence, who returns as Mystique. Nicholas Hoult comes back as Beast. Halle Berry returns to the franchise as Storm in a really bad-looking wig, but it's nice to see her again. Anna Paquin's in this for a brief cameo role as Rogue. She had a bigger role in the film, but her scenes were cut. You can see them in the Rogue cut if you're a huge Anna Paquin fan. I'm really not that big. I mean, I liked her in X-Men. She just wasn't really given that much to do and wasn't really written very well as a character in the future films in the franchise. So I just didn't really kind of care. So it was nice to see her in a little cameo role, but I don't really need to see this movie that's like 2 hours and 11 minutes turn into a 2 hour and 30-something minute long movie because we add the rogue scenes into the film. Ellen Page is also in this cast, again, as Shadowcat, Kitty Pryde, who had a bigger role in the comic that this is based on, but she still has a big enough role in this that it doesn't feel like her character is totally disrespected, in my opinion. Peter Dinklage actually shows up as a character named Bolivar Trask, and actually plays a character that actually has a good performance. This is a good performance. This is a great performance. I can see why people think Peter Dinklage is a good actor, because this is a great performance. And it's the best performance I've seen from him in a film. There's all the other movies I've seen him in, like Pixels and The Boss. He sucked. So I can now point to a film where Peter Dinklage actually didn't suck in terms of his acting. Ian McKellen also has a little return to the franchise as Magneto, as does Patrick Stewart as the older Professor X. Ashmore. Shawn Ashmore comes back as Iceman Bobby Drake, as does Daniel Cudmore, who plays Colossus. And you have a few newcomers as well. You have Omar Sy, who plays Bishop, which I honestly think they could have done better in terms of the casting. This guy was a pretty lame bishop, to be honest. Even Evan Peters plays Quicksilver, and he runs away with the film. Man, I love this character. I never thought I would like him as much as I did, but I absolutely did. He runs off with the film, and you really want to see more of him because he's in the film for a little bit, but I just wanted to see more of him after the film was over. Um, I guess they wanted to keep him short and sweet because they knew how awesome of a character he was, and they didn't want him to like dominate the running time and just steal scenes from the other X-Men. But man, I mean, I would have been fine with that because he's great in this. Josh Helman plays a young William Stryker. You also have Fan Bingbing, who plays a mutant named Blink, who could teleport. Adan Canto plays Sunspot. And you also have Booboo Stewart, which is a very unfortunate name. Oh, Booboo! And Fan Bingbing. I mean, who the fuck gave these people these names? What were the parents thinking? These names are terrible. Fan Bingbing, Booboo Stewart. That's laughable. So Booboo Stewart plays Warpath. And you also have some cameo roles by Famke Johnson as Jean Grey, James Marsden as Cyclops, Lucas Till as Alex Summers, Havoc. And there's this actor named John Kite who plays a young Toad. And Michael Lerner also has a bit role as well as Senator Brickman. And Mark Camacho plays President Nixon. So you've got a really big cast. There's a lot of characters in this, a lot of actors, and for the most part, they're all given their respective roles, and it doesn't really feel like it's too jam-packed, even though there are a lot of characters in the film. Now, the movie, for me personally, it has a pretty long list of pros. One of them is definitely the direction by Bryan Singer. He comes back, and you can tell he had passion for this film. You can tell he wanted to pick the franchise up off the canvas and rehabilitate it and get it ready to go back into the ring again and to kick some ass. And it really does show in this film. I don't know what happened to his directing after this, but the directing here is on par with his direction in films like X-Men and X2. It's a great job in terms of directing. He does a wonderful job with the camera angles and with the movement of the camera and creating certain emotions that are necessary and needed for the story to have legitimate weight to it. Yeah, I mean, it was a nice return to form for Bryan Singer, especially after subpar or just shitty films like Jack the Giant Slayer and other movies like that he did before this. Cinematography by Newton Thomas Siegel is also really good. He does a great job using lighting and getting the most out of the environments that are in the movie. Especially the sequences in the 70s. The sequence where the Sentinels are being displayed at the White House. There's a lot of moments in this film that Newton Thomas Siegel really does shine as a cinematographer. The editing by John Ottman is tight. And I keep using that word when it comes to editing, good editing, because that's exactly what you want a good edited film. That's what you want out of a film that has some great editing is tight editing. Editing that isn't loose. Editing that doesn't feel like it's all over the place, or the editor chopped the film up with a rusty knife or a rusty butcher knife or a rusty blade of some kind, because you don't want editing in a film to look choppy. You want it to be tight. You want it to be smooth, and that's definitely on display here in this movie with John Ottman's editing. Now, it's amazing to me how much of a dual talent he is, because he's a great editor and he's also a great composer. He comes back and does the score, brings back the X2 theme for the opening credits, which is a great choice. And I know I wasn't really praising his score in X2 that much, but I did love the main theme, the main titles. And he brings them back here And they work perfectly. Even added a little bit of a darker sort of vibe to it, which fit with the film and the tone that it had. And so, but I mean, it just gave the movie this epic feel right from the beginning. I have to admit, the opening titles gave me chills because I was like, "Ooh, cool! I love this theme. It's nice to hear it again." Um, and the other music that he did in the film was also quite good. I actually like this score better than his overall score from X2. Um, the screenplay by Simon Kinberg, I also think is a real highlight. Um, think about it. I mean, this is a one-man show. This is one guy wrote the screenplay, and clearly he did his homework. He read the comic this is based on, took some elements from it, and made it his own. But at the same time, I still felt like the spirit of the comic was still here in this film. It may not have been the best adaptation possible of the source material, which is one con that I have to be honest, but it still was one of those films that respected the source material. I never felt like it was disrespecting the source material, and I gotta give Simon Kinberg huge props for that as well. And I really think a lot of his other elements of the story, I mean, the writing, the and the story itself, and even the dialogue, especially, I loved the speech that old Professor X gives to his younger self. I thought that was a really nice speech, a poignant speech, and the film has a great tone to it. It's a darker film, but it doesn't feel like it's too dark. It has fun with itself when it needs to, with stuff like with the Quicksilver scene, and it does a great job with these characters. And it also does a good job with its twists and turns, and the interesting dynamic between characters like younger, like the Professor X, James McAvoy, who's this is post first class Professor X, who's depressed, who's down on his dumps, who's uh, not in the best of shape. He's kind of addicted to this drug that enables him to be able to walk, but it completely makes it so he can't use his powers. He's disheveled, and he even tells Logan to fuck off. So I mean, it was that was a kind of dynamic that you don't normally see with Professor X. So that was really interesting to see him also have the try to rebuild the relationship between him and Eric was also a nice touch. So and also the same thing with Raven as well. This is a great follow up to First Class, and in a lot of ways it's better than First Class because it focused on one story. There is one story arc. That's all. Just one story arc throughout the whole film, and the main story arc is trying to prevent this future, where these Sentinels, who have been created now with a mix of Mystique's DNA, they are wiping out the mutants in the future, which is what the comic was based on. Days of Future Past. And so the Sentinels are wiping them out. And so Shadowcat ends up finding a way to send Logan's consciousness back into his body in the 70s in order to find a way to get Professor X and Magneto and some of the other X-Men that were still around back then to unite and to stop this future from happening. So that's the main. It's kind of like the Terminator. It's type of post-apocalyptic sort of thing. You got to stop the future. We got to stop Judgment Day. But I like that. I like that it was a simpler, just more straightforward plot. It wasn't. We're not trying to tell the origin story for Magneto and Professor X and their relationship, while at the same time trying to tell the origin of the original team of X-Men. We're not trying to do two things at once. And I really appreciated that immensely when it comes to this story and to this script. Um, and it had some nice things to say about society as well, but it didn't seem pretentious to me. So I liked that too. Now, The visual effects were also another thing about the movie that were a really great standout. Except for a few sequences, like I mentioned earlier. For the most part, the budget is used really well on the screen with the visual effects. Um, Especially this is especially notable in the Quicksilver scene, which is that's one of the next things I wrote down here. The prison breakout with Quicksilver, where they break out Magneto out of his prison. That is a crowd pleasing, scene stealing sequence. I love that. I love that shit. I love that scene. That is such a great sequence. It's a lot of fun. I love the song choice. I love the way that it's set up and directed and edited. It's a wonderful sequence. It's very creative, very unique, and it was really entertaining. The score by John Ottman, like I said, is definitely another thing about this movie that really works. The performances by the cast, for the most part, are all really great. Hugh Jackman, James McAvoy, Michael Fassbender, even Jennifer Lawrence. I thought she was quite good in this. Nicholas Hoult was fine for what the little brief role that he had in this. Halle Berry's in it for a bit. She, it kind of feels like she's there for a paycheck, but she's not given a lot to do anyway, so she's fine for what she's asked to do. Same goes for Ellen Page, and Ian McKellen, and Patrick Stewart, and Shawn Ashmore, and Daniel Cudmore. Uh, but some of the other performances by some of the other actors weren't really not that great, but they weren't given that much to do anyway, so it's kind of hard to really judge them. But Evan Peters, like I said, I loved him. I loved his personality. I loved his charisma, and I want to see more of him. And thankfully, you would see more of him in the next film, which is one of the few handful of things that I did like about that movie. And I'll get to that. I'll get to that later. It's just kind of hard. It I guess it's because I watched these back to back, so that's why they're kind of in my head right now. Both of these, Days of Future Past and Apocalypse. Um, but yeah, performances were all really solid. The pacing was another thing that I thought was really fantastic about this film for the most part. It did have to slow down a little bit at one point that I think it could have tightened itself up a little bit there. But for the most part, really good pacing. I mean, the first 40 minutes flew by like nothing for me. It was a really quick pace for the first 40 minutes, an engaging, interesting story that I wanted to see where it went from there, and a unique look at time travel, because it's sending Logan's consciousness back to his old body. It's not sending him back into the future, and I thought that was different, and I enjoyed that. And so, but like I said, the pacing really great for the first 40 minutes. Then it kind of gets a little bit dramatic and tries to do this drama stuff and kind of slows down a bit. And there's not much action, and there's just more of these sort of dramatic moments with the cast members. But once it stops doing that, then it picks up with the pace again with the main plot, and it doesn't really slow down after that for me. It just kept going at a good pace from that moment on. So this is one of those films where the pacing is a pro and a con, but for the most part, it's a pro. I also really love the climax and the ending, especially the way that Magneto ends up turning the tables on the U.S. government with the Sentinels. That was a great sequence. I love the scene where he lifts the stadium up and is floating it around and using it as a shield of sorts. There's some great human drama in this climax, and there was also some great mutant drama in this climax as well. So it was a very effective climax for me. Um, so, and it wasn't really the most action-packed climax, but it was just the size and the scope and the scale of it that was so big and was so well done, especially the editing as well. It was another thing that was really great about this climax. The way that it edited and together the sequences from the future uh, with the past was really well done. Now, the movie did have some cons, though. I do admit it could have used more action. There really isn't a lot of action in this. There's a little bit here and there. There's a Quicksilver breakout scene. There's a few little scenes here and there with some little fisticuffs and fights. But really, there's not a lot of action in the film that really registers on the adrenaline scale. So it definitely could have used a little bit more of action. And that's one of the main reasons why I personally prefer X2 over this. Is because X2 I thought had more action, had more sequences that get your blood pumping. This doesn't really have a lot of those scenes. It's definitely more of a plot and character heavy film. But, you know, when there are some sequences that do have some nice bits of action, they are good. It's just there isn't a lot of it. Um, the pacing, like I said, it slows down after the first 40 minutes. It takes a little bit too long, in my opinion, to recover. But once it does fine. The future looks a bit bland and cheap. It does. It really does. It looks bland and cheap, and the Sentinels look really generic. They really do. I'm not a fan of the generic-looking Mystique TNA Sentinels. That's really generic-looking CGI, just blobs that really were disappointing. I preferred the look of the 70 Sentinels, to be honest, which you see right here, which are closer to what the Sentinels look like in the comic and in the 90s cartoon. Um, Also, the action sequences in the future, they are forgettable and lame. They really are. You have these original X-Men who are there, and the action is just it's not much. It's just CGI carnage. It's just ooh, psh. Magneto throws some stuff and blows up one of the containers. There's these like containers that hold the Sentinels that look like some out of Tron Legacy. Uh, the Sentinels, when they get defeated, it's not much. Just a very and I understand a lot of the action involves the X-Men getting killed by these Sentinels, but that's not really action packed to me. That's just like, damn. I mean, it was effectively brutal. I mean, it's like it's like a Colossus getting ripped in half, Iceman getting decapitated, his head crushed. I mean, a lot of some really intense deaths for these characters, but it's not really action packed. There's nothing memorable about these sequences other than how these characters die, but it's not really that great in terms of action. It's these faceless robots that get blown up by Storm's lightning bolts or get shot at by Warpath or some of this other stuff. So it's not really it just didn't really add that much to the film, in my opinion, the attempts at action in the future, at least for me personally. Um, the cast, at least the new cast members, minus Evan Peters, I mean, just really did nothing for me. They weren't really given that much to do, so like I said, it's hard for me to judge Omar and Adan Canto and Booboo Stewart and Fan Bingbing, but at the same time, they're very bland and generic in terms of their performances. And that's probably the writing that is to blame because you didn't really have the opportunity to have a lot of character development with these characters. So it's kind of like, who are these people and why should I give a shit? And Bishop, I think, deserved much better because he's a 10 times better character than what's on display in this movie. And the Bishop in this is just, where's the big, muscular, badass Bishop from the comics and from the cartoon? This guy looks like a string bean in comparison to me, and honestly has none of the intimidation factor that Bishop had in the comics or in the animated series. So it was nice to see Bishop, but at the same time, not nice to see him because the way he's portrayed in this is extremely lame. And speaking of lame, the after credits scene, I mean, not that sequence. It's the final scene where Logan. And by the way, I want to mention that. Speaking of the final scene, I want to mention that in terms of the pros. I meant to mention this while I was talking about the writing, but it just slipped my mind. I really did like the way that they handled the resetting of the timeline. I thought it was heartwarming. I thought it was poignant. I thought it was a great send-off to the X-Men, to the team, the original team of X-Men from the first 3 films. I thought it was a great send-off to them, and I honestly think that that team deserved that kind of send-off. They deserved that fate. They didn't deserve the fate that they got in The Last Stand. That was just the studio rushing things and wanting to shock people and just being stupid. So, here, the film manages to reset all that bullshit, throw all that bullshit away, and give the X-Men the happy ending that they deserve. And I thought I was going to have a problem with that, but it actually got me choked up a little bit because it was really well done. There was a nice bit of sentimentality to it, and nostalgia, and also care and respect. And it was one of those things that I really did like. And I did not think I was going to, but I did. As a fan of X-Men and X2, it was really nice to see that. So, but on the other end, that's really how it should have ended. It should have just ended right there. With the new timeline, with Jean and Cyclops being alive and all of that. But instead, it has this really awkward ending where Logan, where he goes back in his memory and he's starting to remember what happened when he was taken out of the water in the 70s. So he gets taken out of the water, and it looks like it's Stryker who's captured him, but in reality, it's Mystique. And then it's just like, why? What is going on here? Why is it Mystique? Why is Mystique masquerading as Stryker? What is she going to do with Logan? What? And this is never even referenced or even carried over or even explained in the next film. Logan is in Weapon X by that time with Stryker. So it's one of those things that's like, what? Like, I don't get, why did it end like that? That didn't make any sense to me. So that was completely, that was just, that ended the film on the wrong foot for me. It was just one of those like, what? It just made me just scratch my head and just be like, what? I don't understand that the thought process there with that ending, with that choosing to end the film that way. And I also thought the after credits scene was unnecessary. I understand they're building up to Apocalypse, but it's really not a necessary scene. It's just young Apocalypse in Egypt, and people are praying and chanting his name, and he's helping build pyramids or something. It is just completely unnecessary. It's this is all stuff that people could have gotten when they saw Apocalypse. It was just really not necessary at all. And like I said earlier, I thought it was a solid but not as spectacular as it could be adaptation of the source material because of the way the characters were written and the way things were done and handled with the franchise previously. They had to do some things differently. Also, because First Class was a success, they had to make this also a successor to First Class, so they had to combine the old and the new together into this story. And that surprisingly worked because I really liked that dynamic. I thought it was a interesting dynamic, and I always kind of like that anyway in these films where the future person, like the future selves of somebody, ends up communicating with their past selves. I always found that to be an interesting thing to see unfold on film. But anyway, I don't really know what else to say about X-Men Days of Future Past, except if I was going to rate it out of 5 stars. And if I was to rate the film out of 5 stars, I would give it 4. 4 out of 5. I thought it was a really good movie. I didn't think it was a great film because of those cons that I mentioned. If it amped up the action some more, tweaked up the pacing a bit, it threw in a little bit, more of the source material, made the future look less bland and generic looking, made the action sequences in the future genuinely rollicking and thrilling instead of just meh, and changed up the ending, which is confusing and weird and doesn't make much sense. And then, yeah, I think you'd have a classic. But as it is, it's still a really good film that I did enjoy and I'm glad to have as a part of my collection. So anyway, yeah, another thing that was also great about it, just off the top of my head, because I just saw this and I just remembered, the costume design. I really like that, especially a Magneto. It looks like he's wearing the original uh, costume from the comics or the animated series. But yeah, it's a good movie. I would recommend you check it out if you haven't, and you've avoided it because, like me, you've been burned by the other X-Men films that led up to this. I would definitely recommend giving it a look, especially if you're a fan of X-Men and X-Men 2, because this really is the proper follow-up to X2 in a lot of ways, and it brings the franchise back. It lifts it up, and stitches it up and gets it back out there and ready to fight another day. But anyway, thanks for watching, and as always, I will see you guys later. See ya.